mighty acts of God in history. But the point is then that the Schleiermachian view of religion is far too limited, and it misses the fact that the religious symbols can and are in philosophy and in theology translated into concepts. So that philosophy is trying to conceptualize what religion is symbolizing, which is why the history of philosophy finds its culmination in a Hegelian kind of idealism with a panentheistic being, because this is the truest conceptualization of what religion has been symbolizing. So his theological thinking then comes out that way, emphasizing on symbolism and its philosophical conceptualization. In other words, symbols that are, in their root meaning, rational concepts. Rational concepts. And it's this which appeals to him about the Christian religion, is that the one and the many come together, and in that rational concept you find the pinnacle of early Greek thought, moving beyond the atomism and the monism to many in one and one in three. So, okay, Hegel then on religion. Now, questions, comments? Yeah, Troy.
It seems like Hegel's panentheism is more closely resembles pantheism than does against God being inner things. I mean,
Yeah,
not much distinction.
yeah. There's a history, though, of Christian theologians, or people writing at least matters of theology, who are somewhat panentheistic. That was true of a certain amount of the Christian Platonism that developed historically. You remember the question in discussion of Plato, is he a dualist or an idealist? Now, if he's an idealist, matter is simply non-being, has no existence. So that physical particulars are simply manifestations of form with physical qualities, but not with material substratum, you see. Now, by the time you translate that into Neoplatonism, those manifestations of form are emanations from the one, and you've got panentheism. Now, when you get to some of the Cambridge Platonists in the 17th century, late Renaissance, you find that some of them are not just Christian Platonists, but talk explicitly of emanation, you see, are idealists in that Neoplatonic sense. Influenced by them, I believe, is John Milton, whose work on Christian theology talks of emanation rather than ex nihilo creation, curiously. And yet, of course, we think of Milton in his Paradise Lost as the epitome of somebody dealing with orthodox theology. Well, and Hegel's influence in the 19th century is such that there was quite a bit of Christian Hegelianism, Christian idealism, I'll be commenting on that in a little while, which also tended to be panentheistic. I think it's a fair generalization that when Christianity, Christian theology combines with idealist metaphysics of a monistic sort, rather than pluralistic as with Berkeley, that you've got panentheism as a result. So in that sense, are you going to call his theology Christian or pantheistic? Well, I mentioned to you last week that our old colleague Stu Hackett's going to be doing a Kant seminar this time next year. I remember one time when we were discussing this, and he said, well, it seems that there are others who can be reduced logically to theists, but in itself it's an unstable position. So, you know, what's the response to your question? Maybe yes and no. Hegel thought of himself as a Christian theologian. My guess is he would have difficulty taking the Chalcedonian formulation of the doctrine of the Trinity in its intended form seriously. Yeah. Yeah, Spinoza seems to be clearly a pantheist. Yet it's plain that these German idealists have a high respect for Spinoza. You find them referring to him. But at the same time, they try to detach themselves from his pantheism. What conceptually, theoretically, is the difference? And I think the answer is that Spinoza has a static universe and a static deity, you see. Consequently, there is no room for Hegel's more to God than there is to the cosmos. Nature of God, coextensive. In the case of Hegel, by virtue of process, there is always more to God than there is at any stage in the history of the cosmos. You see, so panentheism comes through. Some degree of initiative and transcendence and freedom is ascribed to God, particularly freedom in the creative spirit sense. Yeah. Whereas the notion of freedom is not exactly a popular term in Spinoza.
Some of the things, especially a statement like our self-consciousness is really God's consciousness, remind me a lot of the mysticism, the position of the mystics.
Yeah, yeah.
And I'm wondering if that's kind of far out.
Yeah, you see, I think that the mystics of the Middle Ages were, not all of them, but I think it's fair to say most of them, Neoplatonists. Christian Neoplatonists, or Jewish Neoplatonists, as the case may be. Islamic in some sense. And consequently, their expression of religious devotion talked of reunion with the divine. You see, not just contemplation of God, as Aquinas would put it, but some sort of mystic oneness with the divine. There's similarity, yes, between the two for that reason. The Platonic, the monistic idealist roots. Yeah. Well? Well, he'd say any story of divine intervention is symbolic. Now, the question is, what within the conceptual scheme is it symbolic of? You see. So if you regard the incarnation as an intervention, or some miraculous deed as an intervention, The Exodus from Egypt was an intervention. You see. Now notice how those stories have tremendous symbolism. I mean, you read what the psalmists say about the Exodus. You see, it's a story with a great deal of symbolic significance for their faith. And think of what Christian hymnody says about the incarnation or the crucifixion. You see. The question is, what is it symbolic of? One thing you're seeing here, Carl, is the way in which there tends to be developing a division between history and faith. You see, the thing that's significant for faith is the symbol. You see, the symbols which are an expression of faith, rather than the history which is the foundation of faith to which the faith looks back. You see? So that the historicity of the story is not important. Now, when we get to Kierkegaard, we'll find that Kierkegaard's very conscious of this. We find reference to what's known as Lessing's ditch. The German Lessing had pointed out that there is a logical gap, a ditch, between a historical statement and a statement about faith. Jesus Christ died. He died for our sins. How do you get from the one to the other? He rose from the dead. He rose for our justification. How do you get from one to the other? You see, and this was one of the, this became one of the dominant issues in the tensions, conflicts between liberal and traditional theology in the late 19th and first half of the 20th century. Still is. Crucial. The inerrancy business is simply an attempt, to my mind, to reinforce emphasis on the historicity of the story. You see. That's what's significant. But, no, that's crucial. Very crucial. In fact, there's one of our graduates, Steve Evans, used to teach here, who last year got one of these big Pew Foundation grants, you know, that Bob Roberts has coming up, one of these $100,000 grants, which is giving him a 3-year research project on this problem, history and faith. So it's still a major issue. Well, no, you see, what's the relationship between thesis, antithesis, and synthesis? You see, it's not exactly a hierarchy. It's not a case of a serial business where the second replaces the first and the third replaces the second. No. The relationship between thesis and antithesis is that in the dialectic, the thesis logically entails an antithesis. You see? And the thesis and antithesis together produce the synthesis, which both preserves and cancels out what's come before. And if you want to see that more closely, see it in a normal process of growth. You see? Where the child thesis is negated by the adult antithesis. You see? And the two come together in later stage, what should we say, senior citizen. Yeah. I didn't say second childhood, it's senior citizen. Yeah. Or use a botanical example. I saw crocuses up at lunchtime in my front yard. Or are they croci? I think it's a Latin plural, croci. Thesis, the bulb, seemingly dead in the dirt. The antithesis, a little shoot, producing a bloom. But soon the synthesis is coming. They'll die off in a couple of weeks. And that synthesis will become the thesis for a new antithesis next year. Out of one grows the other. It's an organic model. The first crocuses, they always want the best of the year. Scrawny little things. Okay, anything else there? David? What's the antithesis to his philosophy? Oh, well, there he traces the history of philosophy, from Greek thought on through medieval thought, Enlightenment thought, and the grand synthesis is Hegelian philosophy. German philosophy of his day. Yeah. Now, will there be an antithesis to that? Well, remember we were talking about that the other day. No, once you get the complete synthesis, the full concept of being, all you're doing now is fleshing it out in detail, that is to say, the little dialectical movements within the synthesis. Yeah. So the rest of the history of philosophy is going to be a series of footnotes to Hegel.
I guess the question what I mean, is the synthesis then in a sort of a hierarchy? Is it supposed to be like
Yeah, you see, the thing is that if you map it out completely historically, what you have is a history of art parallel to a history of religion, parallel to a history of philosophy. Art, religion, philosophy. And you can find similarities throughout. You know my story, just turn that around on the side and you've got it. Yeah. So that you've got Greek art, Greek religion, Greek philosophy, and there's parallels. So you can trace the thesis, antithesis, synthesis across that way. But you can also trace it historically this way. Whichever way you look, you can see dialectics.
It seems to me that perhaps religion is a synthesis of art and philosophy.
Yeah, that's obviously what a religious believer is inclined to ask for. But notice that he's not saying theology is the antithesis. Religion is the antithesis. Now there's a difference between religious language, that is to say the language of worship, the language of piety, and theological language, which seeks to conceptualize with precision. You get the difference? Take, for instance, the language of hymnody. Oh, safe to the rock that is higher than I. Rock. And you're getting pictures in there. They're often picked up by preachers with stories of people who hid in a cleft of a rock during a big storm. You see? A rock that is higher, spatial. No, that's not quite exact. No, because the language of piety is often artistic language, with imagery. It's a language of narrative, you see. Whereas the language of theology is that of a conceptual scheme. A conceptual scheme interpreting the theological significance of the narrative. Yes, you get the difference between religious language and theological language. The difference, if you like, between the language of the Chalcedonian formula and the language of the preaching in the book of Acts. You see, whom you no, God who sent his Son, whom you crucified, whom God raised from the dead. That's the preaching of the book of Acts. You see, whereas the language of Chalcedon is rather, and I say Chalcedon rather than Nicaea, is a rather careful conceptualization of the three persons of the Trinity. You see. Yeah. Now there's echoes of the story, much more so in Nicaea. And of course the Apostles' Creed is still a story of religion, of a religious story, the Apostles' Creed. I believe in God the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth story. Jesus Christ, his only begotten Son, our Lord, born of the Virgin Mary story. Crucified under Pontius Pilate. Crucified, dead, and buried the third day, he rose again from the dead, from whence he shall come to judge the living and the dead. Story. You see. But what he's working with is this distinction between the language of religious piety, yes, which is very close to the language of artistry, image, you see, but the images which become symbols now. And what he wants is to get the concept. So it could be that within what he calls philosophy, you have to talk of theological conceptualization as well. Theological conceptualization. Yeah. Now, is that a grand synthesis? Theological conceptualization? Well, you see, then you have to raise questions about the whole assumption. Is the term a grand synthesis really significant if you don't believe in this unfolding of the divine consciousness in the course of history? You see. Now, that's another thing. But it does seem to me that there is sort of a dialectic that goes on between religious and theological expression. You see, the theologian works for the conceptualization. Then he steps back into his worship and sings the hymns with all of the imagery and symbolism of popular religion. Yeah. And listen to the theologian pray. Yes, and his prayers will often include the religious as distinct from the conceptualization. Yeah. And I think that that's inevitable if you conceive of Christian religion as having to do with personal relationship. Because the way you talk about relationships and persons is in terms of story, not just conceptualization. So I'm inclined to think that there is a story dimension that's necessary in talking of a personal God and a relationship to a personal God. Particularly when he's known because of the way in which he has acted. You can't avoid this stuff. Okay, now let's move for a few moments, if we might, to get this glimpse of what comes after Hegel, the transition. Well, there are two ways of talking about the immediate influence of Hegel. One is in terms of the left and right wings of religion, where the left wing lays emphasis on the evolution of religion, the history of religion, and the symbolic nature of religion. And that left wing, as you might gather from the name left, really spurs the development of liberal theology. You'll notice that Stumpf, on page 430, refers to two individuals, David Strauss and Bruno Bauer, two German biblical scholars. Strauss wrote A Life of Jesus, who were very much in this tradition. Their emphasis on identifying God with the human spirit, so that our beliefs in God are a projection of our self-consciousness. And after all, if Hegel tells us that God's self-consciousness, that our self-consciousness, our consciousness of God, Hegel tells us that our consciousness of God is God's self-consciousness in and through us, then somebody's going to turn around and say, then we can think of God in terms of our own self-consciousness. You see, and the self-consciousness, notice this picture again, the self-consciousness becomes the lens for thinking about God. Now that move becomes explicit in the work of Ludwig Feuerbach, who is one of the people I've asked you to read some selections from for this week, very vivid. Feuerbach is one of the primary influences in shaping the thinking of Karl Marx. That is to say, Feuerbach was a materialist who combined Hegel's dialectic of self-consciousness with a materialistic interpretation of history. And Marxism picks up from that and takes it further. So that you have some selections from Feuerbach in which he says, and get this, man's God consciousness. Now Hegel said that man's God consciousness is the self-consciousness of God. Feuerbach says man's God consciousness is the self-consciousness of man. And man's God consciousness is the self-consciousness of man. And so the idea of God, the concept of God, is something that we project as an extension of our own self-consciousness. And we ascribe to God attributes that are symbolic of what we see ourselves to be. So that theology really becomes simply a veiled exercise in psychology and anthropology. Simply that. The